for a few weeks for Bible class, and I thank God for those people who have been following us, of course, with our Bible study. But we're back today. We had to be out for a couple weeks for uncontrollable purposes, but yeah, we're back. And we will have, of course, worship today, this week as well. And so we're just looking forward to what God is going to do. We said in our last worship that we were going to be talking about in Bible class from the book of Galatians chapter number 5. Galatians chapter number 5. And so I want to just get into that because we're going to be talking about God's grace. God's grace in the midst of everything that we have been dealing with. We are back on the subject matter of looking at what God wants us to do as we share with each person about, how to get through the trials and tribulations of life and things that we're dealing with during this dilemma. But all of our lessons up until now have been about, the attributes of God. And we've been talking about basically about encouragement, the point of encouragement, the attributes that points us towards encouragement during this dilemma. So now God has just changed us a little bit. So we're going to be talking about a little bit about the position of warning this time. Because God not only wants to encourage us in the midst of everything, but he also wants to make sure that we are warned about, anything that's coming up in the midst of everything else that's happening. And so we're going to turn a little different position, taking it from the encouragement side to the warning, what God's saying to us about the situations at hand. And what is he saying to Christians? Because we know that Christians are dealing with this dilemma in a special way, being away from church for so long, being away from the things of God for so long. And now we got to be warned about, what Satan is doing. And so make sure that we are on the right track, because we do know that Sunday morning is not just for Christians. They are what we call church goers too. And so we're going to talk to church goers as well, who have been away from church, who have been away from the temple of God. And the longer we be away from the temple of God, the longer Christians been away from the house of God, or the church we call it, or we can call it long we have been away from the fellowship, from the gathering, from the assembling of ourselves together. The adversary takes opportunity for that. And so we don't make sure that in the midst of all of our celebrations and all, and we're going to preach about some things this week as well to help us, better understand what we're trying to tell you about this warning position that we're in now. That we must understand that Satan is still busy. And so he's still doing some things as well. And so we're going to make sure that as we are spending time away from the church and spending time away from the fellowship of people, spending time away from the gathering and the assembling of ourselves together, that we don't forget that there are some things also that we need to pay attention to. And so to make sure that in all of our celebrations and all the things that we're doing, that we don't forget and get so bogged down in those things that we forget about the things that work against us, the opportunity for the adversary to work in what we call the works of darkness. And so that's what Galatians is going to bring to us today, this message about, what to look out for while we are, celebrating and, having a good time, what to look out for, not to be complacent with that, and knowing that Satan is still busy. And so we all not only, again, have Christians that are not going to church anymore, but we also have what we call church affiliates. These are the Sunday morning crowd. Okay, and so we have them as well. Because you understand. Let me just throw some statistics by you about so we can understand where we're coming from. Is that as far as we have been away from church, and as long as we've been away from church, some things will change in the way we deal with life and the way we deal with things, because there are some people who were connected to church, and church was all they had to keep them focused. Church, the assembly of ourselves together, was what we had to keep us all on the right tracks and focused on the right things. And so since we've been away from that fellowship and that assembly, and we've been away from the church, Satan has a way to deal with those things. So he takes advantage of that, and so we're not to just take this thing lightly. So let's just kind of dig in and see what's happening, because, when we look at it before the virus, we always give some evaluation there. Let's do that one more time. Before the virus, what was happening before the virus with church affiliates and church crowds and Christians? Okay, all of us were attached to church, and when we were attached to church before it was happening, only about 50% of the churchgoers were actually going to church. People were going to church. Only about 50% of Americans were going to church, and that's before the virus hit. And about 10 to 20% of those who were tithers, and about 37% of those who attend church regularly, and about 87% of those have Bibles in the home, and this before the virus. But 32% of them never opened their Bibles, and so we can kind of see, why we need to be concerned about, being away from it, being detached from it for all this time, because Satan is really working on the numbers, and so he's working on the numbers so that after the virus, let me say what's happening now, because we did surveys after the virus has happened. After this virus has happened, the givers has gone down to about 3 to 4%. And so there's already the impact, you see, about being away from the assembly, being away from the church. And these things are happening. So 32% of people we say never open their Bibles. There are people who will never open their Bibles now because they are away from the church. They only opened their Bibles when the pastor took the text, okay, on Sunday morning. So Sunday morning actually gave them a time to open their Bibles and get in church and get attached to some things. And so some things have changed. Satan has worked away from what is really need to be done. He's worked us away from what needs to be done. So we're going to look at this candidly, but let's look at it closely, because we're not talking about the grace of God. So I'm not so much concerned about the giving, and I'm so much concerned about some of the other things that are happening that have changed since this virus. But I'm really concerned about what is happening in the text, the falling away. Is that the more people stay away from church, the easier it is to not get back to church. They're falling away. And so he says it about the falling away from grace. Okay. And so I want to kind of, talk about that for a few minutes, because there are some people who got this confused too, got this text confused as well. They use this text to support the fact, their facts of, us losing our salvation, falling away from God, and falling away from grace as being falling away from God. And once God has saved us, they're saying that we can fall away from God, we can be unsaved, and that's factually not true. But yet there is a word that God has in this text that's cautioning us, though. And so we got to make sure that we understand what he's really saying in the context. If he's not saying falling away from grace as far as, being unsaved and, because you're away from church and you start doing things that are not churchy, doing things that are not Christian, you start doing morally wrong things because you are out of the auspices of the church and the fellowship of the church, that you're falling away from God, falling away from your salvation, and you're not doing that. But there is a danger in it. And so there's a warning that God wants to bring to us as we look at this a little bit closer. And so then I'm really concerned about that. We call it apostasy. And he deals with it in this text, okay? He says there's a falling away. In verse number 1, let's just dig in here. In verse number 1, he says in chapter 5 of Galatians, he says, first of all, stand fast. Why did he tell us to stand fast? Because he knew that was a falling away. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty which Christ made you free. And then he says, be not entangled again, watch this, again, do not go backwards. Do not fall backwards into the yoke of bondage. And so this is how he starts it out. Paul just goes right in there and he says, listen, I know you've been away from church. I know you've been away from the fellowship. I know you've been away from the assembling of ourselves together. You know, all those things that God forbids us to do is for a reason, because the strengthening, there's a strength of actually coming together. And there's a support system of actually coming together as believers. And so being away from the church fellowship, being away from the church is not all about some of the other things. It's more about actually being cautious because there were people who depended upon that strength of the fellowship of the brothers and the sisters coming together in support of one another, in helping one another to stay focused on what God really has for us to stay focused on. And that is what is more important. Okay, what is more important? So he says, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty. Okay, liberty, the freedom. Okay, the freedom that God has given us, that he has set us free. Once God has saved us, in this text, he's really supporting the fact that once we're saved, God is still with us, but we can fall away from grace. We can fall away from the morals in which God has called us to. And he talks about it as being fruit of the Spirit, because there are two sides to this thing. Is that the fruit of the Spirit is something that is birthed in us, okay? It is not something that we try to do. It's not a law. He says there's a variation between the law and the Spirit. And so he's talking about here is that he don't want us to fall away from what God has planted in us, okay? What God has told us, established in us. And to bring this home, you know, we can look at it as a battle between the mind and the soul, a battle between what you think and then what you believe, a battle between the law and the Spirit, a battle between sin and salvation, and then a battle between justification and sanctification. We know that we're justified by faith, but we know that we're sanctified by the Spirit of God, the Spirit of God working in us, okay? And once God starts working in us, his grace and mercy is upon us every day, because every day we get up, God has to apply his mercy. He has to wake us up. We don't deserve to get up. Okay, we don't deserve to get up. So when he wakes us up to give us another opportunity to get it right with God, to come back and take inventory of where we are. Because what Satan has done is he has used the time that we have away from the fellowship to work on us in the negative way. And so we got to make sure that we're all focused. We're all, all in it, okay? And so let's look at what's happening in today's society. The governor, let's look at the governor terminology, how he sees, what's happening. He used some terms like essential, what's essential. Now they've changed the actual idea of essential and saying that churches now and other organizations now are essential, and they regret the fact that they tried to put us out of that actual idea of being essential. Yes, the church has always been essential because of the fellowship and because the assembly of ourselves together and the strength that we have. This world, let's say it, this state, this nation is in better shape than it would be if they had no Christians. Okay. The only reason why that we are contained as much as it is because we have God's people in this world. And so God's people is making an impact on the lives of people that normally would have done something else. And so there's a place for the church. It is essential. There's a place for the assembling of ourselves together. And so when we're not assembling together, then there is a strength that is lost, okay, if we're not careful, because Satan uses that against us. And then the governor used the word guidelines, okay? Guidelines are more like, laws or man-made laws. And that's why I use it. I call it unstable laws, because these guidelines change all the time. And so now they're saying that the guidelines actually are just what they say, guidelines, that we are still to use what they call common sense, personal sense, to do these things. And so they opened up the beaches, they opened up all these other things and all this, and then they gave guidelines on the side. And then when we looked at it, in this assembly, in this holiday season as well, you will see that people didn't really go about those guidelines too much. They were not social distant and they were not doing these things. They personally went back to those cells because, again, away from each other, Satan has an opportunity to actually work things against us. And so just because they're guidelines doesn't mean you're going to do them. Okay, because there's a difference again between, this is what Paul is saying, between the law and character. There's a difference between the law and character. So let's look again a little bit closer at what's happening. He says in verse 4, he says, Christ is become of no effect upon us. Okay, whatsoever, whoever of you are justified by the law, for you have fallen from grace. Okay, you are falling from grace. He says that the law will never designed to be strong enough to hold you. And so when we get out there, when we are away from the church, when we're away from the assembly of so on, then what happens is people try to slip back into the law. Slip back to the law. What are you talking about, Pastor? Slip back to doing things your own way and for your own purposes. And we forget about the grace that God has upon us, the grace that God has upon us to live in a good, clean, moral life. And so he deals with it emphatically in these verses. He said we're falling away from grace. And so trying to do things our way, once we get away from God, I don't know, it's just so ironic how we look at this, because sometimes people are weak-minded enough to believe that only when they come to church, does God actually see them. And so when we're away from church, we think that God doesn't see us, that we can do what we want to do and we're not accountable. But I'm telling you, God is everywhere at the same time. And so he expects us, no matter how long we are away from the church, he also expects us to be morally correct, to do things in a moral way, okay, according to the word of God. And so he looks at this variation. He talks about a little leaven. This is verse 9. He said, a little leaven will leaven the whole lump. If you let Satan get in there and make you think that you can run and hide, okay, from God, just because you don't come to church, that just because church folk don't see you doing this and doing that, and just because you're not in the assembly of yourself together, and you're not putting on a show for folks anymore because you're not around the church, doesn't mean that God doesn't hold you accountable. God holds all of us accountable for everything that we do. So if you let Satan get in there and give you a little lump, if he comes in there and just try to sway you away and confuse you about the things of God, and just because you're away from the church, that you're away from God, I'm telling you, you got another thing coming. God is everywhere at the same time. And so someone said that you can run, but you cannot hide. So Pastor, what are you talking about? This is not the encouragement. This is the warning. Okay, and so God is warning us in this text that we're not to become complacent and believe that just because we're away from the church that we can do whatever we want to do, because God still sees us. He says in verse 10, he says, don't be other-minded. Don't be other-minded. Always be Christ-minded. Let this mind be in you, which is also in Christ Jesus. And that is when you're in your home, when you're in the malls, when you're out on the playgrounds, wherever you are, be mindful that you are still under grace, the grace of God. And so this is what we call a liberty, because in verse 13, look at verse 13, for brethren, you have been called unto liberty. You are free. Yes, you are free to do whatever you want to do under your own liberty, your own will. But your will must be the will of God. That's the only way to be in the righteousness of God, is that you have been bought with a price and you do not belong to yourself. And so you got to make sure you do the right things. And then he says in particular, this is what I'm talking about. He says in particular, he says in verse number 15, he says, but if you bite one another, devour one another, if you take heed that you don't destroy or consume one another. And so he says that I know that there's going to be some times that you're not going to do those things which are righteous in God, but make sure that you consider what would God do? Okay, what would God do? There's a saying that we always say, what would Jesus do? Okay, and so we are to measure ourselves basically on how we should do things according to the will of God. Okay, and then he starts breaking them down. He starts showing us the variation between the two. He says, what Satan wants to do is get you off track so that you can divert back to your old self, your old man. Do you know what the old man is? That old man is the man who was working against God. That old man diverting to the old self is the old man. The Bible says that all things have become new, that we are new creatures in Christ. And so we should never divert, back to being the old man. You can't go back to doing your old ways because you have been bought with a price. You have been changed. You have been delivered. You have been set free. And so no matter where you are, it has no bearings on position. It doesn't matter whether you are in the church building or whether you are outside of the church building, whether you're away from God, away from the church. You still have to actually be the same person that you are. And everywhere you go, your neighbors ought to know that you're a Christian. Okay? Not just a church goer, but you're a Christian because you live in such a way. Okay? You have the attributes of a Christian. And so then Paul weighs out the difference between those who are trying to keep the law and those who are keeping the will of God, which is they are living according to the moral will of God. And so then he just kind of lays it out here. He says there's a difference between the works of the flesh and the works of the spirit. That's how he says it then. He says that's different. That's different. How do you know that you are a Christian, that you are under the grace of God, and that you're not trying to change and forge things? You're not letting Satan come in and change the way you do stuff just because you're not in church. In Walmart, in Kroger, and all the other places, we ought to be the same person that we would be if we came on Sunday morning at church. And so this is what he's saying. He says, this is how you know then the difference. He says, the works of the flesh, in verse number 17, works of the flesh are against the spirit. The works of the flesh are against the spirit. And what Satan wants to do is pull us back into an old self and start working the work of the flesh. Forget about, going to church. You hadn't been to church in, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and so forget about that, he says. And this is what Satan is saying. He said, go ahead and do it my way. You're not going back to church. You're not going to tell them when you're going back to church, if you ever get back to church. And so just go ahead and change it over to me. Let me take care of you. God is not taking care of you anymore. God is not letting you get back anymore into the fellowship. I want you to know that that's a will of the devil. That's a will of the devil to pull us away from the fellowship just because we're not in the fellowship here. We are always in the fellowship. The Spirit of God is always with us. He says, be careful not to divert back to the works of the flesh. Look at verse 17, verse 17. For the flesh lusts against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, and they are contrary one to another, that you cannot do, watch this, cannot do, cannot deal, cannot act, cannot morally produce the way you ought to do. And so what he's saying is that if we start paying attention to what Satan is trying to do with us and pulling us away and saying that we're not getting back to church, telling when we get back to church, we're not really dependent on whether we're going to get back to church or not. We are the church. We are Christians. We are believers. And so we don't have to really, that's not a goal of ours. Our goal is to continue to do the will of God, whether we get back to the building or not. Our goal is to live our best, is to be morally correct, whether we get back to the building or not. And so what he's saying is that what Satan will do is that he will try to fool you into believing that you can do stuff without God. And that's why it's important to know that we have the grace of God. This is really what we have, is that we cannot stand against the wiles of the devil as they come upon us, as we are away from the fellowship, if we don't have the grace of God there. It's God's grace that's keeping us. It's God's grace that is helping us and helping us to stay focused. And so he says, these are the works of the flesh in verse 17. And verse 18, he says, but if we are led by the Spirit, then you will not be under the law. And then also he says that you will not fulfill the lust of the flesh, because the flesh will tell you all kinds of stuff that will keep you away from doing the will of God while you're away from the fellowship. And this is our message. Is that he rolls them out. You can read them for yourself. Verse 19, verse 20, and verse 21. He talks about all those things, ending, adultery, witchcraft. He talked about hatred. He talked all these things that will come back in, murderers and drunkenness and revilers, and he talks about all the other things that will come back in if you do not stay focused. That Satan is trying to keep us away from the fellowship of the Spirit, just because we are away from the fellowship of the believers. And so that's what we have to look at it. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to put a wedge in between there. And I'm not going to let him put a wedge between there. I'm going to be the same person that I was on Sunday morning when I was coming to church, that I am out there in the world, in my home, in my community, and in my schools, and wherever I go, wherever I am, and wherever I lodge, I'm going to be the same. And why are you going to be the same, Pastor? Well, this is why I'm going to be the same, because I'm not on the law. I don't have a set of rules, set of guidelines, and I'm not really worried about all those, guidelines and rules and all that, these terms that they're trying to get us to go by now. I'm going to go by the will of God, which is the grace of God, that it makes me who I am. Okay, not who I'm trying to become, but who I am. I am who I am. I am a Christian. I am a believer. And no matter where I am in life, if I don't ever get back to the church building, I will still be the child of God that God called me to be. And that's what I'm going to do. And so I'm going to be morally correct with that. Why, Pastor? How can that happen? Well, it's going to happen because of verse number 22. It's going to happen because of verse number 22. This is why it's going to happen, Pastor. This is why it's going to happen, believers. This is why you can continue to be who you are, and you don't have to, be into what Satan is trying to say to you, that since you are away from the church, the building, that you can, be what you want to be, throw rocks and hide your hand, and, do the things, slip and do a few things, This is why you can't do it. You can't do it. As a Christian, you can't do it. As a believer, you can't do it, because your attributes, listen, watch this now. You watch this very closely, and you listen to what I'm saying, is that the only way you can go against, who God is saying that you are in this text, is that you have to not be the Christian. You were just a churchgoer. Now, if you were just a churchgoer and you were going to church and you are away from church now, you will still be a churchgoer. Okay? And you can do what you want to do. You can do wrong and not feel bad about it. You can, lie and not feel bad about it. You can cheat and not feel bad about it, because you were doing that already while you was in church, in the fellowship, because you were nothing but a churchgoer. You were an affiliate of the church. But if you were a Christian, before these things happened, you cannot but do what God has called you to do. And you cannot but be what God called you to be. Why? Because the Christian, we have what we call products. You produce. And so these are not something that you're trying to get done. You're not trying to live right. You're not trying to be right. You're not trying to do the right thing, but you are producing the right things. Your life produces the right thing. And so, simply put, this is how he said in verse 22. He said that your life is a fruit, and living is a fruit. And so this is what you do. And so he did it by what we call by 9 graces. Okay, 9 graces. And he do these graces like this. He says that here are these graces right here. Number 1, he says love. Number 2, joy. Number 3, peace. He said these are the things that you produce that's on the inside of you. And this is why you can't but stay focused. This is why you can't but do the will of God and try to live right regardless of where you are. It does not make any difference whether you are at the uttermost parts of the world. Wherever you go, if you fly overseas and you go over to the uttermost parts of the world, you're going to still have these 3 things, because what? They are produced in you These are things that are in you. You have joy in you. You have love in you. You love the Lord. You love your neighbor as yourself. These are things that you do. You have the peace of God that surpasses all understanding, because these are things that are in you as a Christian. And so because those things are in you, watch this, and you have faith. Okay? You have these things. And so what are you saying, Pastor? Now, these are the things that happen on the outside of you. Is because you love, because you have love in your heart, you love everybody, because you try to treat everybody right, because you have the peace of God in you, because you have this joy in you, regardless of what circumstances come. He says these are the things that you're willing to do. That as you are outside of the church, as you're away from the fellowship, that you still have long suffering. You still go with whatever life brings. Amen. It is what it is, and you deal with it in that light. You still have gentleness. You still treat people, the way they ought to be treated, and not the way people treat you. You still have goodness. And these are things that you outside, because you have these things on the inside. And you have temperance. Okay. Now, the last things you have is what we call the things that are for God. You have faith. You have faith. You have meekness. You have temperance. You have faith. You have meekness, and you have temperance. These are the three things, three areas in which God wants us to keep focused. So as I go, bring it to a close, and I want you to study down through here and finalize this chapter. There's a final word in there, but know that there's a difference between trying to do the law and just holding on to the will of God, which is the grace of God. These are the graces that he gives us. There are three that are in us. This joy that we have, the world didn't give it to us, and the world can't take it away. And this peace that we have, the world didn't give it to us, and we have it, is on the inside. And regardless of what we go through, whether we don't, again, get back to the church, we are the church. We are the church. And so it's all in us. It goes with us, brothers and sisters. And then we have these things that are outside that because we have what's on the inside, we're convinced that who we are, we know what we're doing. Now, we just suffer alone. We go through what we got to go through. We get through it. We have this goodness. We're treating everybody the way they ought to be treated. We try to live the best life that we can. And then we know that we have faith in God, because these are the things that we have also, not just for our fellow men on the outside, our person on the inside, but we also have these things for God, because we have faith to believe that, listen, there's a brighter day coming, and everything is going to work out for us as we continue to be warned that Satan is busy, but God is doing greater works. And so that's the message I want to give you today, is that don't get so hung up in your celebrations that you forget about that Satan is busy. And we understand that there's a warning here. Not only look at what God is doing, but also be mindful of how Satan is trying to keep us trapped, okay, into believing that just because we're away from the church, that we'll no longer attend to the church, because we are the church. We are people of God. We are royal priesthood. Guys, listen, stay focused on that. And God will continue to keep us and hold us until we meet again. We will meet again one day. If not on this side, we'll meet on the other side. God bless you. Continue to be Christians. Continue to be focused. And watch out. Satan is on the track. Amen.